Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today we are beginning a somewhat lengthy series, continuing the overall series, Treasonous Cabal, Formation of the Deep State, and its contributions to the JFK assassination. And today we're beginning the deep state element, the FBI. Now, we've already covered previous elements involved in this conspiracy, excuse me, beginning with the CIA and the Pentagon and LBJ and the Secret Service. And today we're beginning the FBI. So this will be conspirator number five. Now, uh, it's interesting because many times you hear the CIA and its involvement in the JFK assassination. It's just become sort of understood. I hardly ever hear anyone talk about the FBI. And yet, by charter, by law, the CIA is not allowed to engage in domestic operations. It's right in their charter. It's the law. This whole conspiracy to kill JFK was a domestic operation led by the CIA. So the question I've always had is how in the world does CIA get away with a domestic operation of this magnitude and just walk away unscathed? How did that happen? It would have to necessarily, it would just have to include the cooperation or complicity of the FBI. The CIA was foreign, the FBI is domestic. The FBI's job is to know everything that's happening domestically. And yet, you either have to believe they were so incredibly negligent so as to be like the Secret Service on the day JFK actually was killed, negligence all around, or you have to believe they were in on it. And when you take into consideration the number of CIA assets on the ground in the United States, domestically, operating domestically, all related to this conspiracy, it is impossible for me to believe that the FBI was caught by surprise. And that's one of the questions we're going to seek to answer through this series. I think it's going to be about a 10-part series. It's that there's that much information. You know, you say, well, what was the CIA operation? It was ZR Rifle. If you go back earlier in this series, when I talked about the CIA, we went over ZR Rifle pretty extensively. The ZR Rifle, as it was written in its documents of origin by William Harvey and Silver, was a domestic operation, which that's illegal for the CIA, but that's right number one. That's the very first item that they spelled out in the ZR Rifle documents of origin, using CIA assets against a domestic target. It started 3 or 4 months after JFK became president. It ended 3 or 4 months after he was killed. It was exclusively designed to take out JFK. And it was sort of the counterpart to executive action. If you know anything about executive action was the CIA assassination operation or program for foreign heads of state who became problems. And it was on foreign soil, which is legal. Assassination is not legal, but it was on foreign soil. And they didn't use CIA assets necessarily. They recruited foreign mercenaries or criminal types. And and of course they had foreign targets. So that's the assassination program that the Congress finds out about in the mid 70s. Then they find out about ZR Rifle. And of course, the assumption is they're operating, if they're operating legally, it would be on foreign soil. So the question Frank Church had was, why do you need two assassination programs? What differentiates ZR Rifle from executive action? And what the CIA didn't want to reveal, and what no one wanted to reveal, was that one was foreign and one was domestic. Talk about a can of worms. Uh, and then you start looking at all these different locations, these fields of operations, where now confirmed plots were uncovered and unsuccessful for various reasons. They're all domestic. There was a summertime plot in Washington, D.C. that got blown up by Richard Nagel. We'll talk about that. There was a uh, late fall plot in Chicago that got blown up by an FBI informant named Lee. We'll talk more about that. That was Chicago. There were two plots in Miami uh, in the late fall uh, of '63. Got blown up for different reasons. Um, and then there was a plot in Tampa. It was unsuccessful. It was called off actually by Santos Trafficante. And then he had the plot in Dallas. That's six locations, six different fields of operation, but all here in the States. And you're telling me the FBI was unaware of all six? Of course they weren't. They had FBI informants inside almost every one of those plots. They knew all about it. And then you start looking at the people, the personalities. These are all CIA people. Harvey, Silver, they drew up the documents. They were in charge of the ZR rifle. You got QJ Wynn, who we now know as Jerry or June Cobb. She's sort of over one of the female assets that was over the on the ground operations and was confirmed to have been in Dallas at Redbird Airfield, idling her airplane on the day JFK was shot. You got David Atlee Phillips, who's doing all the disinformation. He's concocting the cover story that's going to be dropped on the head of the unsuspecting Patsy, whichever Patsy it ends up being. You got Guy Bannister, George DeMarshall, and Ruth Payne, all acting as CIA handlers for the eventual Patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald, another CIA asset whom J. Edgar Hoover was very aware of going back years. You got David Ferry, who's going to be the getaway pilot. He's CIA involved up to his neck with Guy Bannister and all the anti-Castro Cubans and Operation Mongoose. You got all these anti-Castro Cubans, and they're all operating domestically in this operation to take out the president, this domestic target. And there's only one way that happens that it isn't exposed, and that's if the FBI covers for the CIA. That's the only way that happens. The legal, the sanctioned legal authority, as far as law enforcement, these kind of operations in the United States was the FBI, not the CIA. So it's the FBI's business to know everything that's going on domestically. There was a lot going on domestically. Then, just to put a cap on it, when it's time to immunize all the plotters and all the CIA parts of the plot, you put your guy, Alan Dulles, on the Warren Commission. He basically runs it. He's the former head of the CIA. And all throughout all of this, J. Edgar Hoover is very aware of what's going on, pre, during, and after. And I would submit, hopefully I'm able to make the case, not only is he aware, he's complicit. Which means if he's complicit, the FBI is complicit. Yeah, so I'm going to, as we proceed through this, I've titled this. This is another part of. Remember, the deep state is defined as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. And as we go through each one of these pieces of the apparatus, CIA, Pentagon, Secret Service, LBJ, and now FBI, part and parcel with each one of those are all these industries that are wrapped up in the function of what they do. And their interests are commingling. They're merging. So it's the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. Of course, I named my channel Treasonous Cabal because initially this deep state was not treasonous. It was treacherous, but it became treasonous when the private sector took over the public sector, and their operating principle of ultra-vires seeped into and actually took over the public sector. Of course, ultra-vires is profits or benefits to us. All we care about is what is in our best interest or what makes us the biggest profit. Public interest doesn't matter. We fire anyone who takes into consideration the public interest. Of course, what becomes tricky is in the private sector, you can fire, but the public sector, you got to wait for elections to fire people if they're not operating according to your interests. And chances are, if they're operating according to the interest of the public, they're going to get reelected. So firing or voting them out is not as practical as assassination. It all achieves the same thing. That's not as practical. It's not as quick. It's not as easy, it turns out. And then the last part of it is you give yourself immunity so you never face any culpability, no liability, never. And so there's several aspects to this. First, we have the definition of the deep state, national security apparatus, and all the industries that feed it. The definition of treason is anything that aids and abets the enemy, uh, working against or betraying your own people. Uh, for example, propagandizing them into wars because wars are lucrative to your industry. They cost the American people their lives, but they make money for your industries. Uh, or betraying your country's government, trying to overthrow the government or kill the king. That's all part of treason. So it's all wrapped up. We see uh, treason being committed once the private sector ultravirus makes it into the public sector. They all conspire together to make as much money and do what's in their interests and not what's in the public interest. And if that means propagandizing Americans into war, so be it. If it means overthrowing governments like they tried with FDR, so be it. If that means assassinating uh, American presidents like they did with JFK, so be it. All in the interest of war. War became the business principle or the business model that was the most lucrative. So uh, prior to the war, the Spanish-American War, we hadn't fought any foreign wars, and we found out through that war, World War I, there's a lot of money to be made. So World War II transitions right into the Cold War. Contained within that are several proxy wars, Vietnam, Korea, and what you need are people that you can control in high offices like the presidency that will greenlight all those continual wars. If you ever run into somebody who won't, violates that principle of ultra vires, you're going to have to figure out what to do with that person. Either fire that person, vote him out of office, or assassinate him. And so that's where the deep state gets into the deep water of treason. And these different parts within the national security apparatus all have their own singular motives, but they share, a lot of them intersect. And so they become part and parcel of this grand conspiracy. They all have their different roles to play. We've seen with the CIA, it basically ran and organized the whole thing. Pentagon was in charge of the autopsy, for example. LBJ was control of the investigations in Dallas and then later in DC. He picked the Warren Commission. Uh, all of the industries that fed the national security apparatus, they paid for everything. The big oil people, the contractors down in Texas. Uh, we'll get into the mob and some other aspects as well, but they were the ones who financed a lot of this. The Secret Service stripped away the security, so that JFK was completely helpless. He was completely exposed. And the FBI was the deep state's immunizing agent, which means its job, because it was the law enforcement function. And so if there's to be justice, if the perpetrators of this plot are to be brought to justice, it's the job of the FBI to do it. They took over. They squeezed Dallas police out, all the state authorities, and they took over. And it was all their evidence that made it to the Warren Commission. So if you conclude that the Warren Commission was fiction, if you conclude that the Warren Commission was fantasy and cover and blamed Patsy, then you have to assume that the FBI, which gave the Warren Commission all the evidence, which the Warren Commission studied, the FBI conducted the investigation, not the Warren Commission. Then you have to conclude that the FBI was in on it. They were just as important, if not more important, to the Warren Commission's findings than the Warren Commission itself. So there are some questions that we're going to look at as we go through this. And I hope if I do a good enough job, I'll answer all these questions. Not all of them on day one, but as we work our way through, and I'll go through and remind you of these questions before each episode. The first question is something I've already kind of mentioned. How did the CIA get away with the domestic operation, ZR rifle, which resulted in the assassination of JFK? It's not even possible if the FBI does its job. Number two, how did J. Edgar Hoover's personal ambitions, his politics, and his deep state connections contribute to the FBI's institutional motives plural, to immunize the plot and the plotters in Dallas? In other words, how did Hoover and his force of personality and all the things that are wrapped up in Hoover bleed into the FBI itself? And boy, once you get into that, that's a fascinating little study because you start to realize that the FBI and Hoover were like two heads of the same coin. They were they were mirrors of each other. His the FBI took on Hoover's personality and everything else about Hoover. Third question is, are there any indications that the FBI had any foreknowledge about what happened in Dallas? Question number four, how did the FBI control the narrative coming out of Dallas? Question five, how did the FBI control the investigation after Dallas? Six, how did the FBI handle evidence in the case? A lot of the evidence we're going to be looking at, there's a reams of physical evidence. Obviously, there's ballistics, there's all kinds of witness testimony and things. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence too. I'm going to stipulate right from the beginning. If you believe circumstantial evidence doesn't count, then turn this channel off and don't watch it again because you, you're you're not going to like the conclusions that I come to because I use a lot of circumstantial evidence. Because when you put all these pieces together, God gave us a brain to think with and to draw conclusions from when you start to see patterns. And when you foreclose on circumstantial evidence and say it doesn't count, which I've heard a lot of people say, all I care about is documents. All I care about is, something I can feel, see, hear, and touch. You know, a lot of these people don't even care what witnesses say. They discount witness testimony because they're unreliable. And sometimes that's true. I think it's like I think it's lazy. I think it's lazy to say, well, we can't take these coincidences or these circumstances and put them in a timeline and start to see a pattern and draw some conclusions from it, especially if it's repeated over and over and over and over. I think it's pretty lazy intellectually uh, to say that. So we're going to look at a lot of circumstantial evidence. Another question, how are FBI loose ends dealt with? Loose ends. In other words, people that might be threats to the narrative. Another question, what payoffs were only possible at the end with FBI complicity? And last question, how did FBI begin losing control of the narrative? At some point it did. How did that happen? So those are the questions we're going to be looking to answer. And as I said, we're going to go through a timeline. And I'm just going to go, in some cases, day by day, month by month, week by week, year by year, and just draw us closer and closer to D-Day, which is obviously November 22nd. And then what happens after? And if it, because it comes out almost like in story form. And when you can put it together in one, in my case, like a PowerPoint, and see the progression, you can see where this is leading. And you can see more of the forest. Sometimes there's so many details about the JFK assassination, you get lost in the you can't see the forest for the trees, right? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to pull back, get a 60,000 foot view so you can see the big picture. And in this case, the FBI's complicity. So let's talk about Hoover, because you can't talk about the FBI if you don't talk about Hoover. And you go all the way back to 1919. When I was a little boy, I read a book. My grandfather got me a gift for my birthday or some special occasion. It was about the Black Sox, the Chicago White Sox, and how they gambled away the 1919 World Series. And It's such a big scandal and everything. So that's where we're at. That's black and white photo era. And this is where J. Edgar Hoover is appointed by the Attorney General Alexander Palmer to be his special assistant. And he had prior to that worked in I think it was the Library of Congress or something. And he'd learned meticulous categorization and organization skills in this library, how to collect data and organize it into card catalogs and stuff. Remember the old card catalog? You'll see a lot of that in Hoover's work going forward, stemming from his time working in these library settings before he got into law enforcement. But here he is. He's the uh, special assistant to the Attorney General, Alexander Palmer, and he was given a responsibility to head up a new section to gather evidence on, quote, revolutionary and ultra revolutionary groups. And of course, what that means back in 1919, if you're familiar with that era, we had a Red Scare. There were a lot of folks scared, the communist revolution has just taken place or is taking place in Russia at the time. And there's this fear that communism is going to look to expand, take over the world. And so we had a lot of folks that are panicked about communism, the spread of communism potentially in America. And Hoover was one of them. He was a rabid anti-communist. So over the next couple of years, he begins organizing and arranging for the arrest and deportation of people he suspected being communists in America. He's sort of the original deporter in chief. And while he's doing this, he's creating this massive card index, which remember, that's his roots. He came out of a library setting. So he decides all this evidence he's going to file away in these big file cabinets and create this massive. This is before computers, so this is the equivalent of a computer today. Obviously, it's no comparison. But so he had about 450,000 people that he had categorized in these files. These were folks that had left-wing political views, and so these cards had pretty detailed indexes and biographical notes on creating a sort of a hierarchy of the most dangerous to the least dangerous. You had about 60,000 in the most dangerous category. Now, this leads to what history regards as the Palmer raids. And I've taught this for years about the Palmer raids. I really wasn't aware of J. Edgar Hoover's contribution to these Palmer raids, but it was Palmer who, as the Attorney General, signed off on these raids to literally round up these people and deport them. But it was on the advice and the counsel of his special assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, to do this. So that was November 7th, towards the end of that year. This is literally the second anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which began in 1917. So this was intentional to pick this date. Hoover arrests on this day 10,000. This operation obviously was in the wings, just ready to drop at any time, and they waited for November 7th to make a point, to make a statement. Anyway, he arrests over 10,000 communists and anarchists in 23 different cities. So this is a nationwide effort. You can imagine the uproar that might have caused. And a lot of it was symbolic because most of these people were American citizens and they had to be released, given due process rights, et cetera, et cetera. But it was intentional. I saw an article the other day and they were talking about what's happening right now in Minnesota and how a lot of the people being arrested, the American people are under the impression that they're going to be deported, but a lot of them are American citizens, which means they have to go through all the due process rights. They've already been released. They were detained, arrested. Now they've already been released because they're American citizens. So the question would be, well, what's the point? You're going to you're going to meander through the legal system for the next 10 years trying to deport these people? Really? No, that wasn't the point. You see here what the point was. You find out who these lawyers are that are willing to represent these people. This is what Hoover did. Once he found out the names of these, it was like hundreds and hundreds of lawyers who had to come forth to represent these 10,000 suspected commies. Then he adds these lawyers' names to the database, and now he has, in his view, the names of lawyers who he is adding to his suspected communist list. So has a real chilling effect on the legal profession. Maybe they didn't realize it at first. I think they're probably onto it by now. But when you come forward and sign up to represent these people, you can bet your bottom dollar that your name is going to end up on some list as well. And that opens you up to some kind of investigation. If you have anything to hide, you're probably going to shrink back from that. Anyway, it happens on both sides. When Trump was being arraigned and charged with all these different crimes prior to the election, one of their targets was all of his lawyers. Same thing. They were trying to make it impossible for Trump to find lawyers, no matter how much money he has to pay him. They don't want to be next on the hit list. Well, both sides do it. So anyway, Hoover's persecution of people with left-wing views had that chilling effect that I just mentioned. For example, membership in the American Communist Party was about 80,000 before these raids in 1919, dropped all the way down to 6,000. Nobody wanted their name on the rolls of the American Communist Party. That thought it would get into the wrong people's hands. In other words, Hoover's hands. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, during the civil rights era, the KKK never had actual physical rolls with people's names on it for a long time anyway. For the same reason, you know, the secret empire, right? So there's no hard evidence that you're in it. And anyway, for me, in the American Communist Party, there actually was hard evidence, but it dropped pretty quick once these raids started. So that was 1919. A couple of years later, he gets promoted to the assistant director of the Bureau of Investigation. We don't have a federal Bureau of Investigation yet. It's just called the Bureau. And he begins enacting all kinds of reforms within the agency. And by 3 years later, 1924, he's promoted to the head of the Bureau. So he's now in charge. So he's risen through the ranks. And he begins emphasizing things like, excuse me, recruiting and training agents, trying to get more competent agents, more professional, trying to professionalize the agency. He also established a fingerprint file. So in addition to his files on left-wing political people, he's also establishing a fingerprint file. It would eventually become the largest file in the world to have these identification records on hand. Simultaneously, he would bend politicians' ears in Washington, complaining that the Bureau did not have enough authority or enough power, that there were some limitations on its power to be able to carry out its duties. For example, law enforcement in those days was purely a state activity. It wasn't a federal one. And so the Bureau of Investigation that he was over was at the mercy of the state authorities. He didn't think that was right. And then secondly, he said, my own agents can't carry guns or make arrests. They have to go to the state authorities for that sort of enforcement. So, even I can kind of see his point on that one. If you're the FBI and you can't carry guns and you can't make arrests, you're sort of a toothless tiger. And that was his point. And he complained about every chance he got. That was 1924. So for about 9 years, he's just building this Bureau of Investigation and living his life. Turns out he has some skeletons in his closet that people are starting to notice. Journalist Ray Tucker wrote a pretty scathing article about Hoover and his bureau, and even made some passing innuendos in this article. This is the article here, um, and he used, uh, like I said, innuendo to cast aspersions on Hoover's character. He said, "quote," in one of the most bombastic quotes, he said, "quote, Mr. Hoover looks utterly unlike the storybook sleuth. He is short, fat, businesslike, and walks with a mincing step." That word mincing has some symbolic power to it. That's why I chose that word. He dresses fastidiously with Eleanor blue as the favorite color for the matched shades of tie, handkerchief, and socks. I don't know if any of that would mean anything to us today. Eleanor blue, mincing step. I had to go look them up myself. But mincing step in 1933 was a reference to Hoover's feminine gait. Eleanor blue was associated with lavender, a euphemism for male homosexuals. In other words, Ray Tucker, of course, Hoover knew what he was doing. Ray Tucker, without saying so, perhaps because he didn't have direct evidence, is alluding, using his craft of being a wordsmith, he's alluding to the fact he suspects that the head of the Bureau of Investigation is a gay man. In 1933, that would have been a scandal that would have ended J. Edgar Hoover's career. And so you got to tread lightly, especially when you're dealing with somebody who has the kind of power that he has. Of course, Hoover immediately orders an investigation of Ray Tucker and begins leaking this information about Tucker's private life to the media, which has a chilling effect on any other investigator, any other journalist investigating Hoover. So just like he did in 1919 when he arrested all the suspected communists and waited to see who would step forward and represent them and put the names of those lawyers on a list, just as that had a chilling effect in the legal profession, his investigation of Ray Tucker had a chilling effect on the media. And that was the design of that. In 35, Congress finally gave Hoover what he wanted, and they federalized the Bureau of Investigation and created what we now know as the FBI. And it gave Hoover's agents power that they didn't have before. They could carry weapons, they could make arrests. He uses that, gets a big budget, uses that to create a scientific crime detention lab at FBI National Academy to train future agents, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when the FBI really hit the big time. A year later, remember, he's a rabid anti-communist. That's how he got his start. That's what Palmer really set him out and unleashed him to do. That's how he made his name. So that's going to follow Hoover throughout his entire career. This rabid anti-communism is going to follow him all the way up through the late 60s, 70s. He's always going to be on the hunt for communists. It's never going to end for him. In 36, this is the first documented surveillance of American citizens. All right. We've already seen that he's been surveilling American citizens and arresting them for being suspected communists. But this occurred during the Spanish Civil War, which is a war to try to, there was some communist element there, some fascist element there. And, we always pay attention to these wars because people are afraid they'll spread, right? So Hoover arranged for FBI agents to surveil, and report on Americans who had volunteered to go over and participate in the Spanish-American War. They made up what was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And there were different battalions within that brigade. And the one battalion in particular he was interested in was called the George Washington Battalion. He later wrote, after he this was several years later, but he wrote that when a civil war broke out in Spain in 1936, the communists acted in line with the theory that the Soviet Union should be used as the base for the extension of communist control over other countries. Here's that Red Scare, the fear of communist expansion. In response to directions from the Comintern, which is the sort of like the Congress of the Soviet Union, Soviet intervention in the Spanish Civil War included the organization of international brigades to fight in Spain. A typical unit was the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, organized in the U.S. In other words, Hoover's conclusion was that everyone fighting in this Abraham Lincoln Brigade is doing the bidding of the Soviet Union, the Comintern. And they're fighting in the Spanish Civil War under a name that gives it credibility here in America. I mean, who could besmirch the name George Washington or Abraham Lincoln? So you choose real patriotic sounding names, but it's cover for what he said was really just a bunch of communists. These are American communists recruited from America, fighting under the flag, kind of like a false flag thing, fighting under a false flag, George Washington Battalion, Abraham Lincoln Brigade, but they're really fighting for communist expansion in Spain. And basically, he's saying, I'm on to your game. I know what you're up to. I know who you really are. We get to 1940, about 4 years later, and President Roosevelt's trying to engineer America's entry into World War II to help our allies. And he requests Hoover look into Charles Lindbergh. Now, Lindbergh was an American hero. You know the story of Lindbergh, but he's also one of the leaders of the America First Committee. And the America First Committee was not communist. This is where you start to see Hoover expand his repertoire. To this point, he's just been rabidly anti-communist. Now, he expands his repertoire at the request of his president to look into isolationists, people who don't want America to get into foreign wars. You know, when that long ago we fought in World War I. So America First was designed to keep us out of future European problems. And here we are right back in one. And the America First Committee is threatening, you know, here is Roosevelt trying to get us into war. The America First Committee, led by this hero, is trying to keep us out of the war. And so in order to achieve what he wanted, FDR sicked loose, basically unleashed Hoover and the FBI against America First and Charles Lindbergh to try to destroy their credibility or you know, hurt their reputation, in some way discredit their movement, so as to help with his cause. So Hoover agrees, and this is the beginning of what you see Hoover's appreciation, I guess that's the word I want to use, for presidents and the authority that their office gives them to increase Hoover's power. In other words, you're going to see an effort by Hoover going forward to ingratiate himself, whether on the up and up or not so, you know, a little bit underhanded, to exercise influence over that president or have a relationship with that president or use leverage against that president to get what he wants. You're going to see a continual effort by him going forward with all these succeeding presidents. And it starts with this interaction he has with FDR, where he kind of likes being the president's errand boy. He likes the recognition he gets for that effort. He likes the position that puts him in next to the president. You know. Anyway, Hoover agrees, and he gives FDR these As a result of this surveillance, these investigations, he gives pretty detailed reports to him on other, not just Lindbergh, but other prominent America First isolationists like Burton Wheeler, Gerald Nye, Hamilton Fish. Remember Gerald Nye? He's the namesake for the famous Nye Committee after World War One, where I think it was the Senate, revealed how much money American companies made as a result of World War One. And basically, the conclusion was war pays. And he was afraid that war would become a foreign policy objective going forward because it was so lucrative to all these industries. So this is that same Gerald Nye. Anyway, afterwards, Hoover, this is what I said, he gets hooked on this drug, being the president's errand boy and being recognized as an ally of the president. He says, Roosevelt writes to Hoover, thanking him. He says, this is in 1940, I have intended writing you for some time to thank you for the many interesting and valuable reports that you have made to me regarding the fast-moving situations of the last few months. So, yeah, it's nice to get a letter from the president, especially if he's bragging on you like this. And there's documented uh, evidence of Hoover's reply, which he said, quote, your letter is one of the most inspiring messages which I have ever been privileged to receive. I look upon it as rather a symbol of the principles for which our nation stands. When the president of our country, bearing the weight of untold burdens, takes the time to express himself to one of his bureau heads, there is implanted in the hearts of the recipients a renewed strength and vigor to carry on their task. My God, it's getting deep in here, is it not? So this is where I think you start to see Hoover's uh, plan going forward to ingratiate himself with the president of the United States, because it's only going to increase his power and his influence. And eventually he's going to run into some people that aren't as accommodating as FDR, and he's going to have to use other means to exercise leverage, but we'll get to that. So he's got a new buddy now in the White House. So 1945, right, the conclusion of World War II, they get their way, they get the war. At the conclusion of the war, Hoover goes back to FDR and persuades him to give the FBI the task of investigating foreign espionage in the United States. Here he is, back to his anti-communist crusade again. He specifies radicals, which in his mind meant communists. Elizabeth Bentley was a former member of the American Communist Party, and he had some leverage over her. In other words, he was threatening to arrest her if she didn't talk. So she begins talking, and she gives the FBI all kinds of information, specifically related to a spy ring, a Soviet spy ring in the United States operating in 1945. You remember, what's the context? The context is we've just dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. And so the context is the Soviets are trying to steal our nuclear secrets. So this is high stakes stuff we're talking about here. So as a result of the information Hoover got from Bentley, he became convinced that there was a communist conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. All right, he made a leap here. uh, you know, what we now know is that yes, there was a communist conspiracy to steal U.S. nuclear secrets. He took it to the next level. So there's a conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. So he goes back to FDR, and they began rounding up, arresting and trying and convicting these folks that Bentley named as being part of this spy ring. And some are pretty famous. I mean, a lot of us haven't heard of Harry Gold or David Greenblatt. Everybody knows who Ethel Rosenberg and Julius Rosenberg were. You know, they actually got executed for their participation in the spy ring. So this was a major coup for Hoover, A, to get permission from the president to do this, B, to come up with the goods that resulted in executions that won him a lot of accolades in the Red Scare America. All right. We're going to come back to this anti-communist crusade over and over and over again. But I want to also lay some other groundworks, some foundational stuff as we continue about J. Edgar Hoover, because during this time he's making not just friends in the White House, he's making friends that we within what we would call the deep state. Remember, the deep state is the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. And of course, there is no more related industry to the national security apparatus than oil. They're like synonymous, right? You can't operate a national security apparatus. You can't fight a war without oil. So it's in 45 that Hoover first starts to become friendly with some pretty prominent oil men coming out of Texas. And this should kind of catch your attention here, some of these names. Clint Murchison, Sid Richardson. And in fact, Hoover got in so tight with these big oil people down in Texas that they invited him into their club. Now, if you have already seen my LBJ series, you know what the Suite 8F group was that operated out of this hotel in Houston, the Lamar Hotel. It was the most prominent political and business, law enforcement, judicial, by judges, uh, people in Texas that sort of ran Texas, even though they were unaccountable, they were unelected in many cases. Some of them were politicians, but most of them weren't. And they got together in this suite. They basically made all the decisions that ran the state. Well, as some of their members outgrew Texas and got involved in DC politics, a lot of this Suite 8F mafia expanded past the borders of Texas and started getting to the national political scene. I mean, one of their members was LBJ. He becomes a senator, a congressman, then a senator, then a vice president, eventually president. Another one of their members they invite in is J. Edgar Hoover. He's one of these sweet, and he has no connection to Texas, but they recognize his value going forward on the national political scene. And not just in law enforcement. So he gets introduced by Clint Murchison and Sid Richardson into Suite 8F and becomes a pretty entrenched member in that organization, up to and including the fact that on the night of before the assassination, November 21st, he's in Dallas at a gathering at Clint Murchison's estate where these Suite 8F mafia types are making their last minute plans for what comes the next day. He's part of this cabal. And that's where he gets introduced to LBJ, and they develop this long relationship that extends for many, many decades or many, many years after. According to Anthony Summers, who wrote the book The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, recognizing J. Edgar Hoover's influence as a national figure, the oil men had started cultivating him in the mid-40s, inviting him to Texas as a house guest, taking him on hunting expeditions. Edgar's relations with them were to go far beyond what was proper for a director of the FBI. All right, so I've tried to introduce to you his anti-communist predisposition and his obsession with anything communist. I've tried to introduce to you so far his willingness to ingratiate himself with powerful people, specifically presidents. And we'll show going forward how he'll use whatever means is necessary to maintain that. And now what I'm trying to show is that he is going to tie himself to the very people that are responsible for JFK's assassination 18 years later. This is 1945. Look at this list. This is not a full list, but I've presented this prior in the LBJ series, but this is a list of Suite 8F members that pertain to the issue that we're discussing, which eventually will be the JFK assassination. Suite 8F. And they called themselves, as I mentioned in the prior slide, the white, I think it was the White Fathers, the Great White Fathers of Texas. So here they are. By the time we get to the assassination, mid six, early 60s, LBJ is the vice president. Albert Thomas is a prominent congressman out of Texas. If you remember that famous photo of LBJ taking the oath of office after JFK is shot, killed, LBJ's on Air Force One taking the oath of office, and after which he turns and he looks at Albert Thomas, and Albert Thomas winks at him, and LBJ smiles at him. That's Albert Thomas. John Connolly's the governor. That's many people think LBJ, that's his best friend. Here's a picture of LBJ, John Connolly, and him are sitting next to each other. And Sid Richardson is looking over their shoulder. He's the money guy, right? All these oil people, they're the money people. You got a judge, Roy Hofheinz. You got Hoover. You got all these big oil people, Hunt, Murchison, Richardson, Dryholes, Byrd. We'll talk about Dryholes here in a minute. Then you got these construction people. These are the money people that backed LBJ all the way to the presidency. And he paid them off with the Vietnam War, and a bunch of other things. Anyway, Brown and Root Construction, George and Herman Brown. Billy Saul Estes was his actual business partner. They were running all kinds of scams in Texas. William Pauley, that's interesting. We've talked about William Pauley. Now he's another one that has nothing to do with Texas. He's more out of Miami. He owned all the transportation industry in Cuba. He owned the buses, the trains, the plane. He owned and then in Miami, he owned same thing, cabs, buses. He was a CIA asset. He used his boat to haul the S-Force around in their attempts to assassinate Castro. He was there, so he represents the CIA. He's a CIA asset. Bobby Baker, who ran all of LBJ's scams out of DC. He was the bag man, collected all the money, carried around paper bags. His attorney, Ed Clark, LBJ's attorney. You remember, LBJ was very good at hiding behind attorneys. He always had 3 or 4 attorneys that plotted all his crime family. Basically, he ran an organized crime syndicate out of Texas. And it was organized, planned, run with him and these lawyers. And of course, you couldn't get to the lawyers to find out what LBJ was involved in because attorney-client privilege. So it's pretty smart, actually. Anyway, this Suite 8F Mafia was nicknamed the Shadow Government because, as I said, they were elected. They were unaccountable. There are a lot of things on their wish list. By the time we get to 63, they're not happy with Kennedy about. We'll get into some of those, but primarily these big oil people were concerned about the proposals from Kennedy to cut the oil depletion allowance from 30 to 15%. I'm sorry. He was going to cut the earnings from foreign oil investment from 30 to 15%, which was called the Kennedy Act. And he was going to cut in half what earnings they could hide in foreign bank accounts without paying taxes on. And then he was going to eliminate altogether the 27.5% oil depletion allowance, which, if you know anything about oil exploration, they call it wildcatting. It's a gamble. You drill, you drill, you drill. You don't know if you're going to hit oil or not. It's very expensive. You could drill 100 wells. That's why they called Harold Dryholes Byrd, because he was known for drilling holes that turned up empty. It's very expensive. So to get people to be willing to risk everything to drill for this oil, the government gave them the first 27.5% oil that they brought up out of the ground was tax-free. Now it's supposed to be an inducement to get more people to do it. By the time we get to 63, we got plenty of people doing it. They're making fantastic sums of money. So Kennedy says they don't need that perk anymore. Anyway, it was going to cost these Texas oilmen about $300 million a year. So that was one of their primary interests in getting rid of JFK. There were others, but that was That was one of them. This is the dry holes bird I was going to tell you about. Uh, in addition to Murchison, Hunt, Richardson, dry holes, interesting to this context because he's the guy who owned the Texas School Book Depository building. He literally owned it. Uh, he also started the Civil Air Patrol, which was where we first see David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald together in that context, where David Ferry was actually the captain. He was over Lee Harvey Oswald. So they have a relationship, went back to when Lee Harvey Oswald was just a boy. And he also employed LBJ's own personal hitman, Mac Wallace, who in 1963 we know was in the Texas School Book Depository building because his fingerprint was found in the sniper's nest. So you can't make this stuff up. So the building that Byrd owned, LBJ's hitman was in. We know because of the fingerprint. And of course, Wallace wouldn't be seen as you know, out of place because he used to work for uh, Byrd. So anyway, just some little anecdotes there. But Hoover was a regular guest at Murchison's hotel in La Jolla, California. It's called Del Charo. And there was a racetrack there. It turns out this is one of Hoover's, uh, this is one of his things. He likes to bet on the racehorses. Alan Whitwer, who was the manager of the hotel, said that you know, Hoover would come in there pretty routinely. He wouldn't pay his bill. And so, eventually he's got all this bill that is unpaid, and he goes to Murchison, his boss. He says, "What do you want me to do about this?" And Murchison says, "Just put it on my bill. Just comp it." Whitworth estimated years later that over 18 summers of doing this, Murchison's hospitality towards uh, Hoover, in particular, was worth about 300 grand. But it wasn't just Murchison just wasn't nursing a relationship or with Hoover. He was also nursing a relationship with Nixon, John Connally, LBJ, Meyer Lansky, and then look at all these mobsters: Lansky, Trafficante, Rosselli, Giancana, and Marcello. That's the company that Hoover, no doubt, was keeping. Every time he went out to La Jolla, stayed at this hotel and bet on these racehorses. So I'm trying to establish here some of these ties started with Murchison and Richardson. And then they got him into Suite 8F, which got him introduced to LBJ. And in Murchison, he's massaging this relationship with Hoover, but not just Hoover. Other politicos that he sees down the road are going to be central to. They're going to be important national political figures like Nixon, Connally. This shows that they have. He's obviously going to be the governor of Texas, but where he ends up, he might be the successor. He might be the guy who follows up LBJ at some point, becomes president. Who knows? LBJ, they've invested in him, and then all these different mobsters. So Hoover, this is what Anthony Summers, I'm going to go back to that quote. I think it's so appropriate here. Uh, Anthony Summers said, uh, Edgar's relations with them, talking about all these big oil people, but also these Suite 8Fers and these mobsters, or go far beyond what was proper for a director of the FBI. I think you can see what I'm saying. All right. There's another deep state figure that indirectly uh, comes into Hoover's orbit because of his relationship with Murchison and Hunt and Sid Richardson. In other words, uh, another guy in the same orbit, these big oil people, puts him in the same orbit with J. Edgar Hoover. His name is George de Mohrenschildt. And of course, this is a really important name going forward when it comes to the JFK assassination. This guy was in intelligence. I did a whole series or a whole video on George de Mohrenschildt, his background in all these different foreign intelligence services, culminating when he moved to America with American intelligence. And in 45, his first U.S. intelligence assignment. This was an educated guy. He's a Renaissance man. Okay. He's good with the ladies, highly educated, uh, in deep in the oil industry, which is how he intersects with these folks, Murchison, Hunt, and Richardson, etc. But because of his intelligence background, foreign intelligence, he gets hooked in with American intelligence when he comes to the United States. He ends up moving to Texas, earns a degree here in Austin from the University of Texas at Austin. And in that capacity, connects with a new group of oil barons, the ones we've been talking about. Clint Murchison, H.L. Hunt, Sid Richardson. Remember, H.L. Hunt, I did a whole uh, video on H.L. Hunt. He was the richest man in the world. So these are big time movers and shakers. And all of them at different points hired the Morgenshell to secure oil leases and conduct surveys. In other words, to find the oil before they drill for it. They don't want a wildcat. They want to know where the oil is. His real job for the U.S. intelligence during this period was to to gather oil geopolitical intelligence from these big oil people. In other words, tell the CIA what these guys are up to, where their plans are next, especially with respect to foreign oil speculation and their relationships with foreign governments, et cetera, et cetera. So he's doing that. Then he gets assigned a new intelligence assignment. After World War II, he actually moves to Venezuela and works for another prominent family, the William F. Buckley. If you remember William F. Buckley in the TV show and his ties to conservative causes in America, this was his family. William F. Buckley came from money, Pantepic Oil. And there he's again on assignment for the U.S. government, for the CIA, collecting more oil geopolitical intelligence from that company. So this guy, de Marshall, is thick as thieves with the CIA. He's literally an asset collecting an oil geopolitical intelligence from all these big time movers and shakers in the oil industry. Murchison, Sid Richardson, H.O. Hunt, William F. Buckley's family's oil company, Pantepic Oil. And because of his relationship with these people, Murchison, Hunt, Richardson specifically, he has a relationship with Hoover. And Hoover is aware of this guy, George de Morgenshell, very aware of him. In 47, back to the anti-communist crusade, he warns the new president, Truman, that there are several officials in his government that were secret members of the Communist Party. And he names one in particular. His name was Alger Hiss. Truman doesn't take him seriously. Truman doesn't jump to or give him the permission to go on this goose chase like FDR had. So here you see what Hoover will stoop to get his way, to get the influence he wants, or to get the power that he wants. Even if the president, when he went to FDR, when FDR came to him, he jumped to and gave FDR what he wanted. And in exchange, when he went to FDR gave him what he wanted. So they were scratching each other's back. The same cannot be said for Truman. Truman didn't jump to when Hoover went to him. So Hoover decided to leak information. Okay, you won't take this guy, Alger Hiss, seriously. I gave it to you in confidence. I'm going to leak it to different politicians that I know will. And of course, he knows Richard Nixon. They're in the same orbit. They may have, I don't know for a fact, this is one of those circumstantial pieces of evidence, but they're both members at that same, they go out to that hotel at Murchison's own out in La Jolla, and they go to the racetracks, and they're in that same group that mingles together at that hotel and at that racetrack. You saw Richard Nixon's name there. So he knows Richard Nixon is a rabid anti-communist, and Richard Nixon is a young, up-and-coming politician. And the best way to make your name in America during this Red Scare is to go after communists. So he feeds this information to Nixon. Of course, Nixon's only too happy. to go after this Alger Hiss. And that's how Nixon made his reputation uh, in America with the larger electorate. He was from California. He had a reputation there, but he had designs on national politics. And he needed an issue. He needed a cause. He needed something that would put him on the map. Well, Hoover gave him on a silver platter Alger Hiss. And you know the history. They went after him. Uh, Nixon went after Hiss in hearings with HUAC, the hearings on American activities, got him charged and convicted of espionage, or not espionage, but perjury. And uh, and that made, as far as the conservatives in America who were rabidly anti-communist, like J. Edgar Hoover, that made Richard Nixon's. They established his bona fides with them going forward and created this idea in everybody's minds. It set the table for what would come later, right? In the 70s, when he traveled to Russia, when he traveled to China. If Kennedy had tried that, they'd accused him of being a traitor because he was considered soft on communism. But Nixon doing it, the American people trusted him because they said he's not anti-communist, he's not soft on communism. He went after Hiss. He's the reason Hiss is in jail. So it established his bona fides where later he could do things other presidents couldn't do. Anyway, put him on the map is what it did. And he owes that to Hoover, you know. And of course, Joseph McCarthy was another one. And he would launch it in another direction, going after holding these hearings, going after everybody he suspected of being a communist. That sort of went off the rails. But as far as Hoover was concerned, it accomplished what he wanted it to accomplish. He got somebody on the hook that was going to owe him a favor down the road. His name was Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon owed his national reputation to Hoover and the information he gave him about Alger Hiss. And you know, I'm sure it made Truman look bad. You know, when Hoover went to Truman and said, "Here, you got some communists in your government," and Truman brushed him off. So Hoover goes to Nixon, says Hiss is a communist. And they go after him and they get him. It makes Truman look bad. And you know, if you're Truman, now you realize Hoover's not someone to be trifled with. If he comes to you with information and you dismiss it, he has means by which he can make you look bad. He has other means by which he can accomplish what he wants, and he can go over your head or around you, which is what he did. He went around him. And this is a lesson to Truman and future presidents. It's also a lesson to Hoover. Let's talk about the House of Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC. Not only did Nixon use HUAC to get Hiss, but it comes out in a FBI release or a memo in November 24, 1947, that there is a particular FBI informant or witness that should be deposed secretly. And his name is Mr. Jack Rubenstein. We know him as Jack Ruby. The memo reads, quote, Mr. Jack Rubenstein of Chicago, noted as a potential witness, should not be called for open testimony in the hearings. It should be closed testimony because he is providing information for the staff of Congressman Richard M. Nixon. In other words, the FBI is informing the committee, if you're going to depose or you're going to call Jack Rubenstein, don't do it in open hearings, because he is acting as an FBI informant as we carry out this investigation of these potential communists. He is an FBI informant, and he is our conduit to Richard Nixon's office. So what information we have that we want Nixon to have, it travels through Rubenstein. And as such, this is classified information. So the reason I introduced this at this point is to show that all the way back in 1947, not only is Hoover affiliated with these big oil people and all these sweet 8Fers that have motive by the time we get to 63 to kill Jack Kennedy. He's also got relationships with all these big oil people that are paying for said conspiracy. But also, he's tied in with Nixon, HUAC, and as such, has on his payroll an informant named Jack Ruby. I mean, this is all very incestuous. By the time you get to 63 and all these names start popping again, uh, to us, it's the first time we've heard these names. But to Hoover, he knew all these people. He'd been using them. He'd been in relationship with them. They'd been working together. These deep state ties go back decades. So the conclusion is in 1947, during the HUAC year, Jack Ruby was an FBI informant working directly with Richard Nixon, for the FBI and with Richard Nixon. You just can't make this stuff up. Obviously, Hoover is a big supporter of HUAC, just like the Warren Commission in 64, going to get all their investigative information or evidence from the FBI. So too is HUAC. He's feeding it information from his own files, from FBI files, steering it in directions. Investigate this person in Hollywood, investigate that person, this director. 3 former FBI agents even published a pamphlet called Red Channels, and it listed, Joseph McCarthy he's the notorious one for listing all these, or naming some names of potential communists and then not having the evidence to back it up. But before he did that, the FBI did it. But these agents in this pamphlet, Red Channels, 151 writers, directors, and performers. And if they'd ever been in the past members of a subversive organization before World War II, but had not so far yet been blacklisted by HUAC, they are now because their names are out there. These names came directly from FBI files, and an analysis that they had done of the Daily Worker. This is a newspaper published by the American Communist Party. And they literally took the Daily Worker and found these names associated with the Daily Worker and put it in their files, saying the fact that they are affiliated with Daily Worker proves that they're part of a subversive organization, the American Communist Party, and it became part of this anti-communist crusade. And it was included in these files, and they would funnel it right to HUAC. And then what the FBI did is they took this Red Channels and mailed off free copies to all those involved out in Hollywood, like directors and owners of studios, anyone who hires people to act in their movies or play in their roles, whatever, their theater productions, whatever. They sent these names to these folks that do all the hiring for the express purpose of getting them blacklisted so that they wouldn't be hired. These folks that do the hiring realized, oh, this is bad. If I have this information, I hire this person anyway. That's going to make me a target, just like it made, that the media a target when Ray Tucker investigated J. Edgar Hoover, just like made the lawyers targets when they showed up to represent these folks that were going to be deported. Now they're sending these names out to these folks in charge saying, if you hire these people, you're going to be a target. So you know how that goes. All the people named in the pamphlet were blacklisted. And the only way you could get off that blacklist was to go to HUAC and testify and convince these members that you weren't a radical. And it was next to impossible. And like trying to prove a negative. It's almost impossible to do. By the late 1950s, the estimate is about 320 artists have been blacklisted. They couldn't find any work in TV cinema nothing. And this is all the work of J. Edgar Hoover, funneling information through Ruby to Nixon, who sits on this committee and is making this grand show of things. He's got credibility because he's just nailed Alger Hiss to the wall. So now he's got credibility, and you got Joe McCarthy running his mouth, and you got all this going, and it's all emanating from the FBI and the files of J. Edgar Hoover, and he's using as a conduit. He's using Jack Ruby. Isn't that interesting? So we get to 1950. Remember, I said this is a timeline. We're just working our way through the years. We're trying to get to 1958 today. George de Mohrenschildt, this deep state intelligence connection that he has, is now relocated. Remember, he started off when he comes to America, they send him down to Texas, Austin, and that's where he meets Murkison and Sid Richardson, etc. And then he gets sent to Venezuela, and he's looking into it. He's reporting on the Pantepic Oil Company. And now, by 1950, he's brought back he's recalled to the United States, and now he's launching an oil investment firm. He's got offices in New York City, Denver, and Abilene, Kansas. But it's cover. It's cover for what he's really doing. And what he's really doing is collecting more of this oil geopolitical intelligence for the CIA while he's simultaneously establishing this new oil investment firm, no doubt with CIA money. That's 1950. In 52, he now gets moved to Dallas. They're just moving him all over the place. And he instates his ties with Clint Murchison, starts working with him again. He joins several organizations in Dallas. Dallas was a very conservative town in those days. And Clint Murchison gets him into the Dallas Petroleum Club, which means now he's circulating with all the oil guys because they all belong to this. And again, he's collecting oil geopolitical intelligence. He becomes a regular with Murchison at the, quote, Council on World Affairs meetings. This is a very notorious right-wing organization. He becomes a member of the, quote, Texas Crusade for Freedom, where he now is circulating with another cast of characters, such as Earl Cabal, the future mayor of Dallas, Harold Dryholes-Byrd, another one of these big oil guys, and Ted Dealey. Ted Dealey was the owner of the Dallas Morning News. And you should recognize his last name because his daddy was the namesake for Dealey Plaza. So this is a mover and shaker. These are movers and shakers in Dallas. And here's another name. He also works with Zapata Oil, another one of these big oil companies that he's reporting on. And of course, this puts him in contact with the founder of Zapata Oil, George H.W. Bush. I've always found it interesting that, and one day I'm going to do a video on this, or maybe it'll be a series. But George H.W. Bush, there's a lot of connections there between him and the assassination. I don't want to get off on too big of a tangent, but Zapata Oil. Does anybody listening know what the name of the Bay of Pigs operation? It wasn't called Bay of Pigs. It was called Operation Zapata. And boy, what a connective tissue there. That's going to be I know a little bit. I don't know a lot, but I do know there's a connection between, and of course, George H.W. Bush had a very strong connection to the CIA, which he tried to deny and denied until he later became the director of the CIA. But he had CIA intelligence connections going way back, just like George de Mohrenschildt did. And his oil company, curious if that wasn't cover for what he was actually doing, just like all of George de Mohrenschildt's companies were cover for what he was actually doing. And his actual role, Bush's actual role, was as a CIA asset, which is why they named Bay of Pigs Operation Zapata. named after the same name that he used for his oil company. I don't know. That's something I'm going to investigate later. But anyway, you see this cast of characters that J. Edgar Hoover is is affiliated with because he's affiliated with George de Mohrenschildt, because of his ties to the Sweet 8F oil people, Murchison, Sid Richardson, Harold Dryholzberg, H.L. Hunt. Uh, he's a member of the Sweet 8F Mafia operating out of Texas. And de Mohrenschildt's connections are growing at the same time. And so these, on Seinfeld, they call it worlds colliding, right? And you see like the Venn diagram, all these circles are starting to intersect and merge. And this is the company that J. Edgar Hoover is keeping. Uh, According to researcher Gregory Burnham, de Mohrenschildt was an active member of two different CIA proprietary organizations, the Dallas Council on World Affairs and the Crusade for Free Europe, which I mentioned earlier. Look who else is members of these same organizations. Abraham Zapruder. Huh, wow. Of all people. Clint Murchison, Harold Dryholzberg, George H.W. Bush, and Harold Hunt. It's the same people over and over and over again. It's the same people. These people, you want to go back? Let me take you back. Go back to the Suite 8F. See if I can find it here. It's the same people. This is the organization that invited in J. Edgar Hoover, and you see LBJ there, and you go down, there's Hoover, and underneath you got Hunt, Murchison, Richardson, Dryholzberg. Same people. So, as I mentioned, the Venn diagrams are intersecting, they're merging. In 1952, Hoover and Murchison actually collaborated in an effort to get Adlai Stevenson defeated. He's running for president. He was a liberal. And they didn't want a liberal, they wanted a conservative Democrat. And so here you see Hoover and Murchison working together now in an actual operation where they used, no doubt, Hoover's information from his files. Murchison's probably paying for everything. And here you see these people, their interests have merged and collided. And now they're working together. So here in this article, you see those three pictures. I've circled them. And you can see where their interests or how they merge together like a Venn diagram. In 1953, Cartha DeLoach. Now this is the guy here in the picture circled, standing behind Hoover. This is an important figure in Hoover's FBI. He was sort of like Hoover's hatchet man. And he worked closely with this Hoover associate or friend. Now he's a friend, LBJ, pushed through legislation to guarantee Hoover a salary for life. So this is really Hoover's doing, but it's incredibly self-serving, and it would look terrible if he was the one working with LBJ to get himself voted a salary for life. So he used his hatchet man, who was very involved in all the extortion that we're going to be talking about that Hoover ran out of the FBI. Cartha DeLoach was sort of his guy. And so he had Cartha DeLoach work with LBJ, make it appear that Hoover was above the fray. He wasn't involved. But really, it was Hoover's obsession. He wanted to either be FBI director for life or get paid for life. He was always concerned about money and status. DeLoach later recalled of the Hoover LBJ relationship, quote, they both needed each other. He says there was a political distrust between the two of them, but they both needed each other. It reminds me of that old saying, there's no honor among thieves. You're talking about two guys that are just about as crooked as they come, Hoover and LBJ, and they recognize that in each other. So obviously they're not going to trust each other. I remember years later, LBJ was asked why he appointed J. Edgar Hoover FBI director for life. And he said, quote, I'd rather have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. That's LBJ's basically his acknowledgement that Hoover can be a problem. uh, so they recognized that in each other, but they needed each other and they saw the value in working together. So they did to each other's benefit. Uh, in 53, Deloach, on behalf of who, this is according to FBI Special Agent Arthur Murtaugh, on behalf of Hoover, was actually blackmailing politicians that were on different government committees. He said that Deloach once told him, quote, "The other night we picked up a situation where this senator was seen drunk in a hit and run accident and some good looking broad was with him. We got the information, reported it in a memo, and by noon the next day, the senator was aware that we had the information and we never had trouble with him on appropriations since." This went in the file. This was part of this extensive filing system that Hoover was creating. And as I mentioned, he learned through his relationship with FDR and later Truman that he could exert influence on these politicians, leverage if he had leverage on them, and get his way. And uh, if it came to that, if he was friends like he was with LBJ, it may not come to that. But with Truman, it did. And with certain politicians, it would. And certainly when we got to Kennedy, it was going to for sure. By 54, Hoover is not just a friend with Murchison anymore. Now they're business partners. He has joined forces. He's first of all, he's invested in Murchison's oil business, which was smart because Murchison was fabulously wealthy, very good at his job. But he's also joining forces with other oil guys. Richardson, Ralph Young was not oil necessarily; he was a financier and industrialist. And they gained control of a majority interest to get majority interest control over the New York Central Railroad. Together they bought over 800,000 shares. It cost about $20 million. No doubt most of that money came from the oil people, but Hoover was now a partner with these oil people. So that's important because when we get to 63 and we see the roles that Hunt and Richardson and Murchison and Dryholes-Bird, all these oil people had in the assassination, paying for this, paying for that, covering up this, arranging for this. When you see that, and now you realize that a business partner of them is J. Edgar Hoover. And then you find out the night before the assassination, they're all at a meeting at Murchison's estate, and Hoover's there. I mean, again, this is circumstantial, but it's painting quite a picture. 1958. All right, we made it to the year. How about that? Murchison buys and here they go into business again. He buys a publishing company, Henry Holt Company. And he tells the New York Post after he buys it, quote, "Before I got them, excuse me, they published some books that were badly pro-communist. They had some bad people there. We just cleared them all out, put some good men in. Sure, there were casualties, but now we've got a good operation." And guess what? The first book published by the new owners at Henry Holt and Company, Clint Murchison, and his business partner, Jerry Hoover, the first book was published. It was called Masters of Deceit, The Story of Communism in America, published in 1958 by, guess who? J. Edgar Hoover. See how incestuous all this is? It sold over 250,000 copies in hardcover, 2 million in paperback. It was on the bestseller list for 31 weeks. And three of those weeks is the number one nonfiction choice. So this is a way for business partner Murchison to help his new friend and business partner in the railroad thing and all the other business relationships that they had. It's a way to help him make some money. We'll publish your book. We'll market it. You'll make all this money, sell all these copies, be on the New York Times bestseller list. You'll make all this money, which you can turn around and reinvest in our company or our partnership going forward. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Um, According to William Sullivan, we'll get more into William Sullivan later. He worked in the FBI. He oversaw the project. So in other words, this is not a project that J. Edgar Hoover under. I do writing. I do it all myself. I don't have a team. I don't have anybody helping me. I don't even have an editor. I don't have an agent. I don't have anything. I just do everything on my own. And you realize real quick what an uphill battle that is to make any money. Well, my goodness, look at the advantages, Jared. He has no writing experience, his experience is in law enforcement. But all of a sudden, with the right help, you can become a New York Times bestseller. You can get your book marketed, sell over 2 million copies, make yourself a millionaire. If you have the right help, according to William Sullivan, 8 FBI agents worked full time on the book for 6 months. I mean, that's a pretty convenient little arrangement if you think about it. J. Edgar Hoover had 8 agents who work for him, and he assigns them the task of writing this book. That's their job. The taxpayers are paying their salary. He is their boss. They are writing a book for him that he is going to sell and reap all the benefits from. It's unbelievable. Kurt Gentry, who wrote the book J. Edgar Hoover, The Man and the Secrets, published in 91, said that Hoover claimed publicly that he was going to give all the royalties from this book to the FBI Recreational Association. But in truth, the FBIRA was just a slush fund, according to Gentry. It was maintained for the use of Hoover and his aides. It was a money laundering operation. So the director would not have to pay taxes. Says on his book royalties. So he's selling all these books and becoming a millionaire, and he's concerned about the tax liability. So he launders the money through FBIRA, a charity, right? So he doesn't have to pay any taxes. And then he just dips into it and takes what he wants from it. Gentry said that Sullivan told him, quote, Hoover put many thousands of dollars of that book into his own pocket. Yeah, no doubt. When you're the FBI director, you can make those kinds of arrangements. All right, so that's enough for today. Remember, we're looking at these questions, and the first question that I mentioned today was, how did the CIA get away with this domestic operation? And we have not really answered that yet. But the second question was, how did Hoover's personal ambitions, his politics, his connections bleed into the FBI and create an institutional motive to want to participate in this conspiracy? I think we're starting to see his ambitions for power, to have these relationships with presidents and powerful politicians, hopefully friendly, but if not, he can base them off leverage and blackmail, things of that nature. His politics, he's virulently anti-communist. We're going to find out later he's virulently anti-civil rights. He's virulently anti-Vietnam War protester. All these things that are going to be laid at the feet of Kennedy, he and Kennedy are on opposite sides of, which means the FBI and Kennedy are on opposite sides of. And then his connections. We've gotten a small taste of some of his connections to the Sweet 8F Mafia down in Texas, to some of these mafiosos that he meets out in California at Murchison's hotel, where he's betting on horses, to his relationship with these big oil people, relationship with intelligence assets like George de Mohrenschildt, his use of Jack Ruby as an FBI informant to get all this negative information to the HUAC committee, to Nixon, to make Nixon a big name. You're starting to see these connections. All right. So we'll expand on that. We'll keep going, but this was good for a start. So until next time, I hope everybody has a great day and God bless. Thank you.